Thank you. That was a very, very nice introduction. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the museum, your museum. And every year I say the same thing. It is a joy to be invited to open this series, which are stellar, as you saw. And it is part of the great efforts of the team, the San Diego Museum of Art, all of you, patrons, volunteers, trustees, that had transformed this institution. We just saw, as you mentioned, this great project of Spain, and it is heading off to Monterrey. So this show does not finish here, and it was covered all over, but now it's going to open in Monterrey, the north of Mexico. But yes, it's all about what's next, and I'll have also a surprise for you at the end of my talk. So, besides obviously the BUÑUEL exhibition that you already announced, we will talk about the next projects. So, today is about surrealism, and it is about, in Spanish, we say afectos electivos, or selected affections. So, it is not only about pieces in the San Diego Museum of Art, but it is trying to really dig deep with all of you in one of my favorite movements of all the art history. And probably you've heard me say this multiple times, but when one thinks of surrealism, one thinks of lots of complexities. It is so wonderful to think of paradoxes. When we contemplate images of surrealism, or what we consider surrealism, they are apparently simple, easy, straightforward. In reality, the surrealist movement transformed the world, transformed how we see the world, and it is not a style. Some of your questions might be, what style is this? But in reality, it's an idea, it's a concept. So we will see through this talk an enormous array of different artists, different media, that were all swimming to one same concept, which was understanding ourselves and looking through very, very different and distinct lenses. The San Diego Museum of Art has, as you know, special strengths, and surrealism is one of those. We don't have a huge amount of works. They are scattered here and there, artists that are typical of the movement. But what I would like to get into your brains, of course, is ignite this curiosity to learn more. Impossible for 40 minutes, 45 minutes to be touching in depth of each of the aspects surrounding the movement, as I said. But just look into your screen, all the enormous events that happened during the first 50 years, a little starting in the 19th century. I started there with this excerpt of Marx, who was very important for the movement. But just, wonder around the events that you have to bear in mind. The World Wars, one, the First World War, the Second World War, the Civil War in Spain, the creation of this movement. Look at that. It is a lot. Surrealist has everything but simplicity. And bear in mind all these historical aspects, because I think you are going to find why this is so different and why surrealism went and touched the minds of many different intellectuals and many different aspects of the way we see the world. But more importantly, why is it that surrealism is still up to date, something that we all gravitate towards? If you could think of famous artists in your mind, of course, probably many of you would say Monet. But if I drop the name DALÍ, or Frida Kahlo, or Magritte, just remember those enormous cues that are always trying to get and see again and again these artists. So there's something within ourselves that is very surrealistic. So I let that to start. The word surrealism was originally coined, as many of you probably know, by the French writer Guillaume Apollinaire, describing a 1917 production of Jean Cocteau's ballet Parade, which featured both the music of Erik Satie and stage designs by Pablo Picasso. Apollinaire claimed that the performance revealed a truth beyond the real, a kind of surrealism. This word, however, was soon appropriated by another French writer, ANDRÉ BRETON, to describe the activities of a new literary and artistic movement. I'll stop for a minute just to remind all of you that this piece, the Jean Cocteau Ballet, was inspired after Cocteau heard the music by Erik Satie, one of my favorite composers, that was named Trois morceaux en forme of poire, 3 pieces in the form of a pear. What a name. Pieces in the form of a pear. Just start getting the surrealistic passion here. It is one of the most famous pieces by Satie after the Gymnopédie, which probably all of you know. The idea of a ballet, which was completely different from what ballet meant, the idea of combining talent and inviting Picasso to design the costumes, to design the scenery, and to have another genius there working together is what fascinates me. Many of you will recall the Art of Music exhibition that we had here in 2015. We were exhibiting some of those designs for this ballet, which was a loan, I believe, from LACMA, from our colleagues in LACMA. So one of the important points of this moment, for the first time, Picasso or Satie are working for a ballet. For the first time, they are working together. And of course, it caused a lot of criticism, a lot of distress, because they broke the rules of music. And Cocteau decided to insert in the production of these ballets russes music that was noise, typewriters, or cans, or now probably we are stumped, we are learning about all these groups that are current. But at that time, that caused a lot of scandal. So the first time the word surrealism was coined. To describe an event or an experience as surreal, nowadays is to adopt a familiar figure of speech. The word immediately evokes ideas of the weird, the fragmented, the disconnected, inexplicable, unfamiliar. We imagine worlds in which the stones are light and are flying on the air, or the birds, instead of feathers, have stones. The objects all metamorphose in front of our eyes. And so many images. Today, even my day is a surrealist day. I say these things frequently. Everybody laughs, but it is true. Surrealism was a broad intellectual movement that originated in the early 1920s, dominated the years between the wars, and was briefly revitalized in the post-Second World War years. While France, and particularly the city of Paris, was always Surrealism's spiritual home, the movement spread its influence throughout the world. It is important to remember that Surrealism is an international movement. The Surrealist groups emerged into Europe, cities like Prague, Brussels, Copenhagen, London, and of course, the United States and Mexico had exhibitions of Surrealism. Surrealism originated as a response to a crisis in the Western world, in the Western culture, following the end of the First World War. Its proponents sought to liberate what they identified as a corrupted value of society. The spirit of surrealism in the arts is a revolutionary spirit, a spirit that, along with Dadaism, aimed to eliminate traditional forms and subjects in the arts. It questioned the arts of the past, and indeed, it hoped to eradicate all preconceived notions of forms by exploring the unconscious wellsprings of the human personality to bring forth entirely new forms and new subjects. In short, the spirit of surrealism, as Breton said, was intended to be investigative rather than formulative or expressive. Many of the first supporters of surrealism emerged from the movement Dada. This fundamentally anarchic movement had originated in Zurich during World War I. It predated surrealism by several years, and for a short period, the two movements, surrealism and Dada, coincide and coexisted. While Dada and surrealism both denounced conventional bourgeois attitudes and sought to revolutionize several cultural practices, they did, however, adopt very different strategies. At the heart of the Dada movement lays the concept of protest, subversion, and rebellion. Surrealism, however, adopted a more programmatic approach, embracing the psychoanalytical investigations of Sigmund Freud and the political ideology of the Marxism in order to produce its own intellectual revolution. Breton was without doubt the founding father and most significant figure in the promotion of the Surrealist movement. Unlike many of his generation, Breton was not a combatant in the First World War. He did nonetheless witness firsthand the atrocities of the conflict while working as a medical orderly in a psychiatric ward. Here he encountered patients who had suffered severe mental breakdowns as a consequence of shell shock. It was also here that Breton first became familiar with Freud's recent investigations into the workings of the human mind. In particular, he witnessed early attempts through such techniques as hypnosis to unlock the inner workings of the tormented minds of his patients. These personal experiences were ultimately to shape the underlying ideologies of surrealism. The work of Sigmund Freud was profoundly influential for surrealists, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this book. It needs little explanation of this school, but it's the interpretation of dreams that was published in 1899. Freud legitimized the importance of dreams and unconscious as valid revelation of human emotion and desires. His exposure of the complex and repressed inner worlds of sexuality, desire, and violence provided a theoretical basis for much of the surrealists. However, while Freudian psychologists value such techniques strictly as a form of therapeutic treatment, a means by which they could alleviate the suffering of the mentally scarred victims of war, Breton identified a potential method of accessing a new kind of reality in this inner mind, a reality more intense and less controlled by constraints, by the limitations, restrictions of everyday life. It's not only Freud. Surrealism's primary roots were also in French literature. Writers such as Breton, Louise Aragon, Paul Éluard, René Crevel, and others sought to revolutionize language, to create new poetic images by allowing words to flow out freely without conscious control. Back in Paris in 1919, Breton, along with fellow writers Soupeau and Louise Aragon, produced a journal entitled Literature, which soon drew the attention of other young artists and writers. It was here that Breton and Soupeau adopted a new writing technique that they label automatism. In their early experiments, the two writers attempted to produce a poetic work collaboratively, but without any preconceived notion of subject or style, by interspersing randomly conceived sentences that authors produced a text dictated by arbitrary, irrational thought processes. Even the title of the resulting text, The Magnetic Fields, capture the sense of illogicality, disorientation sought by Breton and Suppot. The dominance of the verbal over the visual within Surrealism at this time was reinforced in Breton's first manifesto, published in 1924. We are observing Paul Éluard and Louis Aragon, both French writers, both crucial for this first essays and analysis of the literature and the journalists that started the Surrealist movement before it turned into the visual arts. Paul Éluard might be familiar for many of you, and their lives are absolutely intriguing and interesting. I will just shortcut because it's a lot. But Paul Éluard met Gala, the wife. He was the first husband of Gala, Dalí's wife and muse. They have a very interesting love story. They met at 16 years in a hospital, Éluard and Gala, and they were both ill of tuberculosis. It was such a journey to get together, to be able to marry. Gala, when they were released from the hospital, she had to go to Russia. You know, she was Russian. And he was sent back to Paris to his parents, who of course opposed this marriage. And he was suffering. He wanted to be a poet. And his parents, of course, thought that was not a serious profession. Remember all of these names that we're going to be looking at, intellectual psychiatrists or linguistics, all have to do with the front. It's the moment of the war. So they go back and forth. They have personal experiences. They suffer and see suffering and translate that into each of their professions. This is a very vibrant society, a very vibrant community which has this conversation going on and on. The same cafes, the same spaces, the same readings. It's a collaborative effort to transform the way we see the world today. So Éluard, I don't have more time, but it is very intriguing how he finally, after getting married to Gala, 1 year after, decides to go to the front. He wants to go to the war and be as his peers. He was fed up of always having migraines and anemia, tuberculosis. He was always considered a very light and not strong person for war. So he finally, not abandons, but takes on to the front. And Gala, of course, is fed up. And then the story you know. Then we'll talk about it with Dalí. The manifesto. We were talking now about 1924 manifesto, where Breton defined the objective of Surrealism as a desire to express verbally by means of the written word or any other manner and the actual functioning of thought. This is why it is so fascinating. We are talking about an abstraction. Thought, as many of the artists have said, or the process of thinking, can be written off, but cannot be represented. So we will see how all these artists are looking into Breton's writing and essays, but also the other linguists. By the end of the year, however, the tide began to turn. And in December of 1924, Breton launched a new journal to replace literature, La Révolution Surréaliste, the Surrealist Revolution, that differed from its predecessor in increasing the presence of visual arts. And I am sure that many of you know that Surrealism touched each and every media, from poetry to sculpture, cinema, paintings, installations, and many of the artists were performing in several of those media. In 1925, Breton treatise Surrealism and Painting was serialized in a journal. And over the next 3 years, the careers of artists, including Yves Tanguy, Salvador Dalí, René Magritte, were launched through the pages of this very influential publication. Following Breton's lead, several artists adopted various automatist techniques in the production of their works. The painter ANDRÉ MASSON, for example, often forced himself to work under conditions of extreme duress, after long periods without sleep or food or under the influence of drugs. Masson believed that by forcing himself into a state of reduced consciousness, he would get closer to the workings of his unconscious mind. Another technique adopted by the surrealist artists to circumvent rational thought processes was based upon a children's game of consequences. In this game, a piece of paper is folded into 4 horizontal strips, and the participants each draw a part of a body without seeing the part drawn by their fellow collaborators. The resulting image is thus produced randomly and beyond the overall control of a single rational mind. By adopting this technique, artists like Man Ray, Yves Tanguy, and JOAN MIRÓ produced these collaborative works that were known subsequently as exquisite corpses. The term deriving from a literary version of the game which threw up the phrase, "the exquisite corpse will drink the new wine." Many of these drawings were reproduced in La Révolution Surréaliste, although experiments with the technique of automatism dominated early surrealist practices. Artists increasingly turned to the analysis of dreams as a means to access the inner workings of the unconscious. The world of dreams always fascinated the surrealists, as I have already said, and it was here that their greatest fantasies could be given. From the mid-1920s, many surrealist artists, including most notably Max Ernst, Salvador Dalí, and René Magritte, produced dream paintings, works either based directly upon dreams experienced by the artist or which alluded to the condition of dreaming, in contrast to automatist works which relied upon collaboration of spontaneous mark-making. The dream paintings were carefully planned and executed in a highly and realistic detail style. Jacques Lacan and Jean Piaget, Maurice Hall, and other structuralists assume that the form produced by man reflect an innate structure of the human mind, and surrealist artists created works which established fresh norms of evaluation and which are now judged by very standards that they themselves created. The work of art, as Bresson said, is a window. However, surrealism is concerned with what it looks in on rather than when it looks out on. Like the patient who attempts to communicate the nature of his pain to the physician, artists used every possible means to articulate their inner experiences. In recent years, a method of analysis called structuralism was developed in linguistics, anthropology, literature, psychoanalysis, and the arts. Marx and Freud were pioneers in defining structures beneath the surface, events of history, and the individual personality. In France, Ferdinand Saussure led the way in establishing the foundation for studying linguistics structurally. We have to have in mind that it is all about language and communication and the way we see the world, and it is very complex. But I am here showing you a wonderful photo, which somebody just told me had never seen it. It is very moving to observe all these brilliant artists sitting there and having conversations. And I just want to think, what were they thinking? What were they talking? And even they share their psychologists, psychiatrists. We know that Lacan was the personal psychiatrist of Picasso, but we know also that Dalí was always checking with his own therapists to see if he was being coherent with the process of the Freudian analysis of dreams. But these all are having this type of conversations and with very, very different results. We cannot say that MIRÓ is the same like DALÍ, or DALÍ paints like Magritte or even Tanguy. There are some connections, but a lot of differences. So these photos, I think, are treasures of the moment. And there you have another one in New York in 1942, where you have the presence of Max Ernst, Leonora Carrington, and others having these type of conversations. Marx held man's ways of acting and thinking are determined largely by his relationships to the underlying social structures of society, particularly the means of producing goods for subsistence and for trade. However, Karl Marx did not deal with individual consciousness. Freud, on the other hand, was concerned with the individual. He looked beneath surface events for an underlying structure to help explain what appeared to be accidental or chance behavior. Dreams, he believed, provided a window to the hidden working of unconscious part of himself. Freud's theories established the foundation for André Breton's definition of surrealism. Buñuel. How could we talk of surrealism without mentioning Buñuel? Films also were affected by the revolutionary system of surrealism, and is probably there where we could see the most aggressive and moving representations of what surrealism thought about. Surrealist films dispensed linear narratives and plots, thereby freeing cinema from a reliance on traditional storytelling borrowed from literature. Surrealism creates the possibility of cinema itself as an independent form. It is all about disruptions, disturbing imagery, uncensored by the normal wakeful consciousness or any morality. Atmospheres in the films are incongruous, are like states of dreams. There is a forfeiting of control and complete submission to the dream states. So surrealist films often assaulted institutions like the family, the church, religion, society, even the traditional way of learning. We see that in those films. You cannot understand the pieces of surrealism if we are not bearing in mind this very aggressive productions of silent films or sound films. Luis Buñuel, another important player of the surrealist movement, was collaborating with DALÍ himself in the production of the Andalusian Dog, who all of you, I'm sure, have heard of. The Andalusian Dog probably is the epitome of the surrealist film. That's not the only one. There are others, like L'Étoile de Mer or Germain Dulec. There are many, many films, but the Andalusian Dog, which is not Andalusian, nor about a dog. That's surrealism, of course, provoke the distress in many of the observers, starting with Garcia Lorca. Federico Garcia Lorca, another name that you have to bear in mind, this magnificent writer that was colleague and friends with DALÍ and Buñuel, was offended because he thought they were mocking of him, being him from Granada. That was about himself. But again, it is about shocking, moving, disturbing us, taking us out from our comfort zone and making us think in reality what's going on. So the Andalusian Dog. Now, letting a little, and please somebody tell me about my time because I know I eat all the time. Okay. Yes. 10:36. Thank you so much. Let's go to our paintings. I just wanted to start the grounds for you to think about all these ramifications, all these starting points for what we're going to see now in the world that is much more familiar to all of us. Unquestionably, the greatest influence upon the development of dream painting was the work of the Italian artist Giorgio de Chirico. In the early 1910s, a full decade before Breton's Surrealist Manifesto, de Chirico produced a number of works in which a strange assortment of unrelated objects were incongruously presented within eerie architectural settings. Here, the juxtaposition of unrelated inanimate objects rendering a conventional representational style suggests a significance and meaning that cannot be ultimately resolved. This juxtaposition of unrelated was a huge appeal to the Surrealists, who regularly plundered its potential to disorient their viewers. De Chirico's works, while evoking a mode of nostalgia and melancholy, similarly imply an underlying threat. The strange, low lighting, the long shadows and empty, elongated perspectives convey a dark and sinister mood to the scenes depicted. The strange encounters, represented with the utmost clarity and verisimilitude, seem to encapsulate the world of dreams and nightmares. This simultaneous presentation of the ordinary within the extraordinary, of uncertainty or anxiety, of magic, mystery, and threat, subsequently proved irresistible to the Surrealists. While de Chirico, Giorgio de Chirico, never joined the Surrealist movement, his post-First World War return to the classical style was an anathema for Breton and his followers. His role as a precursor of Surrealism is crucial and mentioned by many of our artists. They were all delighted with these kind of paintings and representations where we are not understanding clearly what's going on. Of course, all of you, all of my docents here, know very well the Memories of Turin from 1916, which was given to this museum thanks to Jackie Littlefield in 1986, and what that painting represents, a landscape of Turin, because it is a place where Nietzsche had his last ultimate breakdown, and de Chirico was fascinated by the works of Nietzsche and had read him while he spent some time in Munich, in Germany, reading the important contributions of Nietzsche. So you know very well that painting, we are very, very proud to have it here at the museum. And then to my left, there's another painting that could be compared to ours. And here we could talk a little bit about the metaphysical paintings. De Chirico called his paintings metaphysical, and he was very intrigued by the representation of the inner being of things. And he thought that objects had different ways of approaching them, and one of those was seeing what you could not see, what is inside an object. And here is where complexity starts. But de Chirico was, as I said, revered and is very well known for this spaces, this combination of studios and spaces, inner spaces with outer spaces. And you will see this concept again worked by his next generations. André Masson. During the First World War, André Masson was badly injured. This experience directed his energies towards a new committed revolutionary stance. His uncontrollable rage against the instant insanity of the war was sometimes so frightening and so intense that at one time he was confined to an institution. Masson joined the Surrealist movement on the invitation of André Breton. Although he accepted, he was never deemed officially a member, being by temperament, an anarchist. All of them are anarchists. Remember, we're coming from the Dada and the times of the wars. Despite his reluctance to become a dedicated member of any specific group, Masson viewed Surrealism as the only artistic movement in France worth joining, the only artistic movement that he respected, because he thought that it would liberate tradition. By the end of the 1920s, Masson had broken with the Surrealists, only to join them again in the 1930s or 1934. Masson moved from France to make his home in Spain. He loved the culture. He threw himself into the activities. He learned about bullfights. He even loved sangria. During this time, he suffered from a dread of his own instincts for violence and disaster. He anticipated another war in France and moved to Spain, as I said, but unfortunately, the Civil War was also, it was a disaster in Spain. So Masson, I am putting at this moment a painting that he elaborated in 1937, La hora de todos, the time for all of us, has arrived. And you would see there his representation of the Civil War, the anxiousness, the furiousness that he's feeling, and of course comparing it to the Guernica. There's a lot of coincidences there. The masterpiece, the Guernica, that needs no conversation. Just for you to know that the Guernica was exhibited in Paris as well, and this was the way to fight against those social injustice and disasters in the north of Spain. What we have here is another piece by Masson. He embarked for America in the 1941, stopping in his way to in Martinique, the Isle Martinique, with BRETON, and this is our own painting. The Germ of the Cosmos from 1942 is a wash and pastel, and another wonderful gift that we got in 1946. Masson visited to Martinique during his escape from Europe to America, toured the small French island of Martinique, and drawing the steep landscapes, the lush tropical vegetation, the lyrical, erotic quality of this painting is enhanced by the smooth rolling line on the initial automatic drawing. The deep, rich variety of colors recalls the visual excitement of a jungle, while the dark underpainting unifies the composition. Masson's work at this time was becoming more and more abstract. So our own painting here. The German-born artist Max Ernst was particularly inspired by the condition of dreams and regularly incorporated dreamlike imagery into his works. Ernst was particularly fascinated by Freud's analysis of dreams and is known, when in Germany, to have read several of his key texts, including The Interpretation of Dreams, indeed, the Freudian notion of the Oedipus complex, Oedipus, Edipo in Spanish, Oedipus in English. Is that right, Graciela? That's a tricky one for me. Oedipus complex. The unconscious desire of a child, found more commonly in a male child to replace his father and to process his mother's sexuality, frequently recurs as a motif in Ernst's works. So I cannot do a talk of Surrealism without mentioning Max Ernst. Unfortunately, we do not own a piece by Ernst, just the tiny lithograph to your right, which is not, of course, doing justice to this magnificent artist, Max Ernst, who, by the way, was the partner of Leonora Carrington and who moved from Germany to Paris, helped by Paul Eluard, whom you know now very well, who lent him his passport in an undocumented way and helped him emigrate to Paris. They were very, very close friends, Ernst and Paul Eluard. Okay, somebody knows this guy. Isn't it amazing? This is like the trademark of surrealism. And if I take all what I have written here of Dalí, it would take us hours. But I think all of you would agree with me that Salvador Dalí has lots of extraordinary events that we should recall. He is one of the most serious and very intellectual-driven artists of the movement. He appears in many of our scenes as crazy, doing aggressive attitudes, being an exhibitionist, putting out there all his sexuality and erotism, trying to bother the audiences. But Dalí is one of the best artists. The way he draws, all of you will agree with me, the way he saw the seriousness that he took to study the old masters, his passion for the Millet paintings. Last year we talked about his passion about Millet, the Angelus, I'm talking about 19th century, and the way he replicated and included signs, the way he understood the Freudian interpretation of dreams, and he wanted to be coherent in this apparent incoherence is spectacular. He did films, we already mentioned his relation with Buñuel, and also had incredible meetings at his house in Figueras in Catalonia. So even this photo, I don't know how many of you have seen this photo, I hope you have, because this is Dalí with a Bouguereau painting, right? Bouguereau, your friend, who's arriving very soon in November to this museum. But even he drew and analyzed everything. I'm putting here images that are very well known for all of you, but we see this capacity of transforming material, solid objects, making them melting and disturbing us in different ways. Dalí created his own method, paranoid critical method, and he was a serious reader of Freud and Lacan and was all about paranoia. Paranoia is changing the reality with your own reality, and he was into that. So no matter how scandalous or all the troubles that Dalí went through, I deeply believe that it's someone that deserves obviously closer attention, and it's the rock star, I would say. You do an exhibition of Dalí, and oh my goodness, we need 3 museums of this size. Perfumes, posters, it's a pop icon. Why is that? If he presents these disturbing images, to your right, of course, all of you know, that's our very own painting, which is a representation of a mindscape, what has been called a mindscape instead of a landscape. But we have done more, people or critics have tried to interpret, why is there a key? Why are the ants? The key is Gala, because Gala opened this man and was able to let him be himself. The ants might be his mother when she passed. I mean, and go on and on in this symbolic things. I don't think there is a necessarily a only unique interpretation, but what I can tell you is that mindscape is representing again a very discomforting, horizontal, tiny landscape that comes from our unconscious. Probably the way we dream, the way we see in our dreams, and those Caesars there, the Caesars that you observe are all objects that are unrelated in a way. And do you remember the erotic beach to your right? This very tiny painting that we had here in the exhibition named From El Greco to Dalí, 2011. It's a very, very tiny painting with this exquisiteness of drawing and this perfectionist in the transparencies, in the ghost. But if you look closer, and I don't know if you could do it from there, but all are infatuated and having orgasms and having, this is a really disturbing subject, but he painted this size like a postcard, so we are not too disturbed. So this is... Anybody remembers this piece? Just raise your hands, because we had it here at your museum for 5 months. Anyway, Salvador Dalí. And of course, as powerful, as outspoken, as crazy that he looked, Salvador Dalí was very close with Buñuel, and that's the fabulous portrait that he made of this genius film director and writer Buñuel. And he got into trouble, as was his favorite thing. He got into trouble because he was criticizing the automatic way of painting. Remember, we spoke about the automatic writings, the automatism through the corpse, exquisite corpses, and the automatic drawings. He thought that that was never going to tell what was going inside of us, and that we had to be serious, and that that had to be reconsidered. So, of course, Mr. Breton, André Breton, was furious, and he expelled Dalí from the group. And using the excuse of this enigma of Hitler. I don't know how many of you have seen this painting, but probably it is that is what allowed Breton to fire him from the group, to put it in a way. That is an incredible solitary painting, and a very mysterious one at the Reina Sofia Museum, and the image of Hitler is on the plate. It's one of but it's grayish. He admired Hitler. That's what we know of all his writings. If somebody wrote about his own works, was Dalí. If somebody experimented, was Dalí. He wanted to be really serious, even though, as I said, we thought he was crazy. The Gala, I like to say that some paintings, this is done in 58, but at this point he has already been separated from the Breton group, the Surrealist group, and he was mocking of religion, mocking of Catholicism. He did that with Buñuel, but then at the end of his life, he gets seriously back to analyze the subjects. And that's the Gala, twice here, these two versions. Of course, it's an irreverent painting from a strict conservative viewpoint, because Gala is Godfather. It's on top of the Holy Spirit. But look at that perfection of the perspective, the counter perspective. Of course, Dalí knew Mantegna, and all of you know Mantegna, and this was a real cultivated man. And that way to present those toes in front of us and to play with the dimension is just amazing. The landscape underneath recalls a metaphysical space, and also you can see tiny, tiny apocalypses, chevaliers, horse riders. How do you say that? Horse rider. Horsemen, thank you. Okay, so let's go from Dalí. This is the collection of etchings and engravings that we have here at the museum. I think you have been able to see them sometimes at the visible vaults. George and the Dragon, unfortunately. I mean, this is just what we have here. Tanguy. Tanguy is another active member of the Surrealist group and often participated as well in the exquisite corpses, in which people contributed sections of drawings. We've already spoke about that. So I'm just going to jump a little bit here and tell you that Surrealists, that Tanguy is one of the few artists of the movement that constantly repeated himself. Tanguy does not change the way of painting, and he is also very, very close to our landscape by Dalí that we saw, doing these biomorphic forms. It's a combination between MIRÓ and MASSON, probably, but they are like dots of painting. But what are these things? What is this? Where is this coming from? Again, from the unconscious, from the dreams, and this enormous, I say enormous space, because it is a sense of grandiosity, even though these paintings are not so big, blurred the lines between the horizon and the land. So another great painting that we have in our Surrealist collections here at the San Diego Museum of Art. Tanguy married an American artist, Kay Sage, and who also was a Surrealist artist, and settled in the United States after the World War II. Joan Miró. Obviously, all of you are also acquainted with Joan Miró, and many critics have considered him to be simple, primitive, childlike, a simple mind, where others are thinking exactly the opposite. This is the most complex brain. Miró also studied in the academy and knew how to copy the old masters and travel through Holland, the Netherlands, and was capable and able to draw in a very traditional manner. But he discovered that the vacuum, the open space, was very important. He's a word of music. And those of you that know music, the silences are as important as the sounds or the tones. So he is thinking and playing with this vacuum. His spots, his dots, seem to be random. And at the beginning of his career, they were, because he was part of the automatismo in drawing. But then he was very carefully playing with those primary colors and with the sense of space. He wanted everybody to feel and to go again in the most important journey, which was inside of ourselves. The museum, Miró, of course, owes a lot to Dada and was also part of the Dada movement, and Miró was who introduced Dalí to BRETON and to the movement. So he has a very important role in this, in this style. Something that I enjoy a lot about Miró is his big pride of being Catalonian. Catalonian, by birth, by temperament, he said. And Catalans, he said, believe that you must always plant your feet firmly on the ground if you want to be able to jump into the air. The fact that I come down to earth from time to time makes it possible for me to jump even higher. This is Miró. So alongside with Picasso and Julio González, he supported the Republicans, and he participated in the exhibitions in Paris. This is, of course, our pieces. You know them well. And the solar bird and the sculpture of this bronze was also given to us as by the Walbridges, this wonderful couple that gave us the majority of the contemporary pieces in 1969. This solar bird is a monumental cast bronze and one of the most well-known pieces from Anita Feldman. Are you here? No, she's not here. Yes. Our expert, of course, in sculpture would talk about the vacuum. What happens with sculptures in the Surrealist world? The same thing. You have to interact with the pieces. There are things that you can see, but things that you cannot. And by moving around the pieces, you will have this vacuum filled up. Okay, so Magritte. Magritte now was, as Miró was experimenting with disintegrating images into spots, Magritte was exploring the strange relationship between familiar objects. The Belgian artist René Magritte also produced works that alluded strongly to the metamorphic nature of dreams. Magritte visited Paris in 1927 and was embraced immediately by Breton's group. By the 1930s, however, he had fallen out with Breton and returned to his native Brussels. Perhaps more than any other of the Surrealist painters, Magritte's work transformed the ordinary and innocuous into the extraordinary. The objects featured in Magritte's works are often of the most mundane nature: the apple, the pipe, a bowler hat. Yet in the context in which these works are presented, it raises awkward questions to all of us. At the first glance, all of us, as I was saying, think of these pieces as posters, marketing posters probably, due to the fact that are probably one of the most reproduced billions of times for everyone. There is a serious appeal, a fanatism, I would say, almost like for Frida Kahlo, for these images. Why is that? I always wonder why this happens. Of course, Magritte is looking into the dreams, very serious intellectual, cerebral thinker. He is somebody that, unlike DALÍ, was intellectually cautious. He was very into the study of language, semiotics. He theorized on the words resemblance or similarity. He, played with the objects as the very, very famous pipe, right? Ceci n'est pas un pipe. Why would this be a pipe? This is a representation of a pipe, but nobody before him had talked about this. He is very much into language, meanings, and how do we approach objects. So this is probably the foremost known element. But why the pipe? People always ask me, why is the pipe? Why the apple? Why the tree? Why the rocks that are flying in the sky? Or why the birds that are transformed into clouds? He just decided to choose objects that were around us, quotidian objects, and invite us to rethink our connection to those objects. So very intellectual, as I said, and his life was not easy at all. He started his life with a tragic event at the age of 12 when his mom committed suicide into a river. And we think about Magritte as, oh, that's a very funny apple or a bird or simplicity. But I always think that this, of course, he saw when his mother was taken out of that river in a gown. There are paintings that represent this, but obviously he was marked by this. He married with Georgette, and he had a wonderful marriage. So this is one of my favorite paintings. I think this summarizes the surrealism for Magritte, and it is the portrait of Edward James, another of his patrons. You've seen this painting, probably multiple times reproduced, and what is that telling us? The mystery of not reflecting what is in front of a mirror. It's, again, digging deep in what we see and what seems logical, but it is not. Or the empire of the lights, those landscapes to your left, to my right, the empire of the lights. It's a typical, simple, flat. That's what it is. It's a flat painting with not a lot of texture, but suddenly this very subtle, fine element of combining night and day in a same painting. Or, of course, the man with the apple, the very ultra-famous painting, which I want to share with you, probably you have not seen. There's the couple of this painting, which is called La Guerre, the war, and it's the woman that has flowers covering her face. They are never represented together, and it calls a lot my attention. But anyway, Magritte, of course, this is Labage period. Magritte, unlike what I just said about Tanguy, experiments all the time. We think he only did the apples and the bowling hat or the pipes, but he's experimenting, he's thinking, and for a short period in the 40s, he is experimenting with this anti-painting, awful, ugly painting that is called the cartoonish. And he did exhibit in Paris this sort of paintings in the 40s and returns at the end of his life to his beloved images and the concept of linguistics. We have here one of the best paintings, one of his last works of art from 1966, as you know, and given also by the Walriches. And again, he's enlarging quotidian elements that are contradictory, that had nothing to do within themselves. And you could think of the pipe as again, current object, masculine object, or the tree. But those two objects together make no sense, even in this simple painting. Then the drawing, also another piece from the museum. And experimenting, continuous experimentation, documentary films. The bottles are very well known. Painted these wine bottles where he had a lot of fun, I would say, was trying to get to the ready-made objects. And the sculpture. We spoke about MIRÓ doing sculpture, but this is probably one of the most famous pieces. And Magritte experimented with sculpture and with painting, and this is repeated. Drawings, paintings, and sculpture went from media to media. Surrealism, as I said, was an international movement, and exhibitions happened in the United States, in London, in Prague, but also in Mexico. 1940, there was a very important international exhibition, and you see there a wonderful photo of Frida Kahlo with ANDRÉ BRETON. Frida Kahlo, ANDRÉ BRETON, you know a lot of them, but look at the photo of our Mandragora. We have this magnificent, I mean, I'm so excited every time I see the Mandragora by Diego Rivera that you have here, and observe that it was exhibited together with the two Fridas. The two Fridas, probably the utmost painting by Frida. They were painted for the same exhibition at the same time. We don't have a Frida here, but we do own that Mandragora, which highlights the mystery of surrealism with that incredible look and that contradiction of the white, the very young bride, with that mandrake or spider web. I don't know if you can see the plant from that end, but the long plant that is a narcotic, and those nails with the skull is also disturbing, this piece. But that was part of the Surrealist International Exhibition that brought together intellectuals and a lot of artists. Wolfgang Paalen, Leonora Carrington, Breton planned on this. But exhibitions were not only a hanging of paintings. The entrance was exciting. There was a lot of dark, a lot of mystery, and a lot of mirrors that received us in every exhibition of Surrealism. So Diego Rivera, of course, Our Hands of Dr. Moore, which you know very well, another great Surrealist piece that we own, and that it's one of my favorite portraits of a surgeon. But you do know that when the surgeon saw these hands, was really taken back. Tamayo was never part of the Surrealist group. I decided to insert in his presence here because Breton was very inclined and impressed by Tamayo and wrote about him. He's representing the modernist movement and the anti-Escuela Mexicana de Pintura. And the subject to my right is the somnambulist, and is this sleeping, walking man with movement and abstraction. Carlos Mérida, born in Guatemala, also studied in Paris and was very influenced by MIRÓ, another piece that we own in this museum and currently is in the 20th century galleries. I'm very happy to see it again out, because as you know, we sometimes have to ship paintings. But Mérida studied music as well and used a lot those languages. But in the early stages, in the 20s, he was very influenced by MIRÓ. Of course, I don't have time to get into Surrealist women, but I would never give a talk without mentioning women. Forgive me. But I promise I will give a talk on them. Those women were fabulous. They entered the world of Surrealism first because they were spouses or muses, and we know Max Ernst and Leonora Carrington, of course Diego Rivera and Frida. Now we know more about Frida, but in those days it was the wife of Rivera. Remedios Varo or Dorothy. We will talk about them. They have been studied recently, and more exhibitions about women surrealists have happened lately. So, my surprise, my surprise to all of you, this museum is preparing an exhibition of surrealism and design, and we will be including our pieces, and we're opening the show in 2022. For the first time, a big exhibition, furniture, lamps, drawings on surrealism. That's the news. Nobody has heard that. So keep it quiet. Not yet announced. Just to finalize, as I said at the beginning, one of the most complex movements of art, ideas, surrealism, has a lot where and what to talk about. I just wanted to give you small hints in a very surrealistic way so you could connect psychiatrist, literature, poetry, paintings, and films. It takes a lot to understand surrealism, but I believe that we will never understand it well, and that's why we are all so attracted to it. So thank you so much, and I hope I opened some thoughts in all of you. Thank you so much.
And you can stay for questions?
I don't think so, but just one or two.
Okay. I think we have enough time for one or two questions. And there's a hand right there. Could you wait, sir, for the microphone? David has that. Oops, I've lost my microphone. Can you stand and ask your question, sir? That's okay.
Is there any connection between that Renaissance surrealism that we see in Bosch and the 20th century surrealists?
Of course it is. Of course, absolutely. So when we said that surrealism was created in this time, of course, it is a way of speaking how we approach this new movement. But not only Bosch, the Garden of Delights, but all his contemporaries were doing these scenes. And Dalí, MIRÓ, Magritte, everybody saw that painting and, of course, adored that painting. Yes, there's your connection. Yeah. See, I think that's it.
Oh, thank you very much for the enlightening lecture. You mentioned surrealism spread universally. Has it ever reached Asia?
There was an international show in Japan. Yes, Japan also saw an exhibition of surrealism at the time. Yes. And today, if we talk about current world, every exhibition of Magritte or Dalí has gone to Asia. Yes. There's a lot of attraction for that. Yep. Thank you so much. Thank you.